Well, I've been here for a little over 20 years now. My area of interest is theory in general, so I teach graduate theory classes, mostly classical, so 19th century theory, and also the required undergraduate theory class that all sociology majors have to take. And in addition to that, I teach other things, political sociology and so on. But the course that I probably enjoy the most is a course I teach for fourth year students. It's a fourth year seminar, Sociology 407, which is the history of Canadian sociology. When I was doing my PhD work at the University of Toronto, I had a background in history from Queen's University, and I'd always been interested in the history of social thought. And while I was doing my PhD studies, I got very interested in the history of Canadian social thought, because of course Canadian sociology has historically been tied to the discipline of history, famous people like Harold Innis and so on. And so I eventually ended up doing my thesis on a topic which was directly in the area of the history of Canadian sociology. And one of the people who was a key sort of focus of my thesis was John Porter. He was born in Canada, Vancouver, 1921. He came from a sort of working class family, really. His parents had both immigrated to Canada from the British Isles. His father was British and his mother was Welsh. The family, his father was what you might call a ne'er-do-well, was not terribly interested in building a career and so on. His mother was a school teacher. And as a consequence of the fact that John grew up at a time when the Depression started, and because his father wasn't terribly oriented toward making a living in the first place,
Right.
As a consequence, the family ended up on the dole, or on relief, or what we would call on welfare now. And at one point, the family's only income actually was John's newspaper route.
Right.
The father eventually left the family in the middle of the Depression. John at that point had an elder sister and a younger brother. And the father left with a wealthy woman. He'd had a number of affairs and left for England. The mother decided that she would follow him to England. But because she had emotionally collapsed in the wake of her husband's departure, John and his sister Eileen, then who were in their mid-teens, were actually responsible for organizing the family's exodus from Canada across the country by train to Halifax and then by ship to England, and they ended up in London. This would have been 1937, so John would have been 15 or 16 years old at the time. They then lived in London for a number of years, the first part of which John worked at sort of odd jobs. He never was able to go back to school, never finished high school. Eventually got a job working at a newspaper as a kind of a cub reporter, in part because British newspaper reporters, of course, at this time were old enough that they would be called up into war service of one kind or another, and John got a chance to be a kind of cub reporter. And at that point, he decided he wanted to be a journalist. Then, because of course he was of the age at this point, in 1941, he would be 20 years old, so he was ideal age to be conscripted, and he made the decision to, before he was conscripted by the British Army, to sign up for the Canadian Army because the pay was better. He then served in the Canadian Army for the duration of the war. He served in the campaigns in Sicily and Italy. He was in the intelligence section, they called it, working in counterintelligence, eventually working his way up through the ranks to become captain by the time he left. And then when he was done his military service, he worked for a year in what they called the historical section, which is how he made a bridge into academia, really, because the historical section was headed by a very famous Canadian historian by the name of C.P. Stacey. And Stacey was responsible for writing the official version of Canada's involvement in the war. And Porter was taken on as one of many people with some academic background or skills, research skills, to help in the writing of drafts of this huge set of books actually that came out eventually after the war. And it was in the process of doing that he decided that he wanted to go back to university, and that's how he sort of made the transition. From never having finished high school, leaving in grade 10, he was able, through veterans benefits, to get his education paid for. And by working in the evenings while working during the historical section during the day, he was able to go to London School of Economics. He wrote the entrance exam, passed, got in, and that's how he got his education.